The bell above the door was still vibrating, a thin, frantic, tinny sound that cut through the heavy scent of old grease and rain. Outside, the world was a blurred gray, but inside, the light of the diner was surgical and cold. Latoya didn't retreat. She didn't seek the sanctuary of the floor or the steel-clad safety of the industrial dishwasher. Instead, she moved with a grace that was almost insulting to the man with the gun. She stepped into the narrow gap between the counter and the kitchen pass-through, her shoulder brushing against Myung-suk's red coat. Myung-suk was trembling so hard the loose threads on her sleeve seemed to dance. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the black snout of the pistol, her mind likely caught in a loop of old terrors that had nothing to do with this boy in a mask. Latoya reached back, her hand finding Myung-suk's wrist. She didn't just hold her, she anchored her. "Eyes on me, Mama," Latoya whispered, her voice a low hum that stayed beneath the frequency of the robber's panic. "Don't look at him. He's just a noise, just a bad sound." The robber's boots skidded on a patch of floor where the rain had tracked in. "I said open it, now!" He was screaming to fill the silence Latoya was creating. He wanted her to beg. He needed her to be small so that he could feel big enough to pull the trigger. Latoya leaned forward, her hands flat on the counter. She didn't raise them. Raising your hands was an admission that the person in front of you held the power, and Latoya had decided a long time ago that she would never give that away for free again. She looked at the mask, cheap polyester, stitching coming loose at the chin, and then she looked past it, straight into the dilated, terrified pupils of a boy who was drowning on dry land. "You're shaking," she said. It wasn't a taunt, it was a clinical observation. "If you fire that thing, you won't hit the register. You'll hit the windows, or you'll hit me, and then you'll be a murderer for $82 and some change. Is that the price of your life today?" In the corner, Jae-hyun watched. He saw the way Latoya's body angled, subtly shielding every inch of the woman in the red coat. He saw the way her white server's hat stayed level, a tiny flag of defiance in a room full of people who had already surrendered. He felt a phantom heat in his chest, a recognition of a different kind of strength, one that didn't come from a gun or a name, but from the simple, terrifying willingness to stand in the gap for someone else. He had spent 15 years in a world of wolves, but he had never seen a shield quite like this. By the time the late-night news cycle began, the grainy security footage from the diner had already been looped millions of times. It was titled "The Unshakable Waitress," a viral snippet of digital lightning that captured Latoya standing like a stone monument against the tide of a desperate man's rage. But in the penthouse of the Lade Heights, where the air was filtered and the silence was expensive, Jae-hyun wasn't looking at the waitress. He was standing so close to the wall-mounted television that the pixels blurred into a mosaic of light and shadow, his breath hitching in a way that would have terrified his subordinates. He watched the girl in the black and white uniform move. He watched her arms sweep back, pulling the elderly woman in the red coat into the safety of her shadow. And then the camera caught a profile. Just a second of a face, lined with years of hardship, eyes clouded with the fog of a fading mind, but possessing a curve of the jaw that Jae-hyun had seen every night in his dreams for 15 years. The remote control cracked in his grip. The plastic groaned, but he didn't feel it. His mind was a frantic machine, rewinding to a night of smoke and screaming, the night the coup had gutted his father's organization and his mother had been pushed into a black sedan to save her life. He had been told she was dead. He had been given a grave to visit, a marble lie that he had watered with his own bitterness until he became the man he was today, a king of shadows with a heart made of scar tissue. "Myung-suk," he whispered. The name felt like glass in his throat, sharp and unfamiliar after a decade of silence. He leaned in, his fingers tracing the screen where the elderly woman's hand was clutched in Latoya's. She looked small. She looked fragile, like a piece of paper caught in a gale. But she was alive. She was working in a kitchen 3 miles from his fortress, washing dishes and hiding behind a waitress who looked at the world with the same cold clarity he did. Jae-hyun turned away from the screen, his coat already in his hand before his bodyguard could even knock on the door. The viral video was a beacon, but it was also a target. If he could find her, so could the men who still whispered his father's name in the dark. The pacing of his heart was no longer the steady, rhythmic beat of a strategist. It was the frantic thrum of a son who had finally found the piece of himself he thought was buried. He didn't care about the fame or the robbery. He cared about the woman in the red coat and the waitress who seemed to be the only thing standing between his mother and the abyss. He was coming for them, and the city would tremble in his wake. The rain had transitioned from a violent downpour to a persistent, rhythmic drumming by the time Latoya reached the 4th-floor walk-up. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and damp wood, a stark contrast to the sterile, terrifying adrenaline of the morning. Inside the small apartment, Myung-suk was already tucked under a knitted throw on the sofa, her breathing heavy with the exhaustion that follows a trauma her mind couldn't fully categorize. Latoya sat at the kitchen table, her server's hat resting like a discarded shell beside her, when the knock came. It wasn't the frantic pounding of the police or the erratic thumping of a neighbor. It was 3 slow, heavy strikes that vibrated through the door frame with the weight of an ultimatum. When Latoya opened the door, the hallway seemed to shrink. Jae-hyun stood there, a specter of charcoal wool and cold iron. He was too large for the space, his presence absorbing the dim light of the flickering overhead bulb. Water beaded on his shoulders, but he didn't look wet. He looked forged. Behind him, 2 men stood like shadows, their eyes scanning the peeling wallpaper with clinical disdain. "Latoya Brown," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice had the texture of deep water, calm but hiding a crushing pressure. Latoya didn't step back. She gripped the edge of the door, her knuckles turning the color of ash. "The diner is closed. If you're looking for a statement, call the precinct." Jae-hyun's gaze drifted past her, locking onto the sleeping form of Myung-suk. For a fraction of a second, the iron mask slipped. His throat moved in a hard swallow, a ripple of raw, agonizing humanity that Latoya caught before he could bury it. "I am not with the police," he said, his eyes returning to Latoya, searching her face with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. "I am here because you are the only reason she is still breathing." He reached into his jacket. Latoya's muscles coiled, her heart hammering a protest against her ribs, but he didn't pull a weapon. He produced a heavy, cream-colored envelope. "The diner fired you an hour ago. They said your profile was a liability," Jae-hyun stated, his tone flat. "I am opening a new flagship, Aries. It needs a manager who doesn't flinch. It needs someone who knows how to guard what matters." He held the envelope out. "The salary is 4 times what you made in that grease trap. There is a private suite for her, medical care, security." Latoya looked at the envelope, then at the man whose suit cost more than her life savings. She saw the power in him, the kind of power that didn't just offer help, it owned it. To accept was to trade one kind of danger for another. "I don't take charity," she said, her voice a low, dangerous warning. "And I don't take leashes." "It isn't charity," Jae-hyun replied, stepping an inch closer, his shadow falling over her like a shroud. "It's a debt, and in my world, we always pay our debts." The morning sun filtered through the apartment's grime-streaked windows, catching the dust motes that danced over the worn linoleum. Jae-hyun sat on a kitchen chair that looked like it would snap under the weight of his presence. He had sent his men to the hallway, leaving him alone in the cramped space with the two women. On the small table, a jar of yellow mustard and a loaf of bread sat between them, the humble components of the sandwich Latoya was preparing for Myung-suk's lunch. "Alma," Jae-hyun whispered, the words sounding like a prayer he had forgotten how to say. Myung-suk looked up from the table. She blinked, her gaze wandering over his expensive watch, the sharp line of his jaw, and the deep, aching hunger in his eyes. She didn't scream, but she didn't smile either. She simply tilted her head, the way one looks at a stranger who has asked for directions in a language they don't speak. She turned toward Latoya, reaching out to tuck a loose strand of hair behind the younger woman's ear. "Is he a customer, Toya?" Myung-suk asked, her voice light and thin. "Did you bring him for tea? We don't have much tea left." Jae-hyun flinched as if she had struck him. He leaned forward, his hands trembling, a mirror of the robber's hesitation, though born of love rather than fear. "It's me, Jae-hyun, your son, the one who liked the honey cakes you made on the 3rd floor of the old house. Do you remember the song about the magpies?" He began to hum a low, halting melody, but Myung-suk only frowned, a shadow of distress crossing her face. She pulled her hand back from the table, retreating into the safety of Latoya's side. The fog in her mind was thick, a white wall that Jae-hyun's wealth and power couldn't tear down. Latoya placed a steadying hand on Myung-suk's shoulder. She looked at Jae-hyun, and for the first time, her gaze wasn't just cold, it was heavy with a terrible shared grief. She saw the king of shadows crumbling in a kitchen that smelled of vinegar and cheap bread. "She doesn't know you, Jae-hyun," Latoya said softly. It wasn't an insult, it was a diagnosis. "To her, you're just a man in a suit. I'm the one who wakes her up when the nightmares come. I'm the one who knows how she likes her mustard spread thin, not thick. You can take her to a palace, Jae-hyun, but she'll wake up wondering who the stranger in the hallway is." Jae-hyun looked at his mother, then at the waitress who held her so effortlessly. He realized then that his mother wasn't just missing, she had built a new world where he didn't exist. To save her, he couldn't just be her son, he had to be the man who protected the woman she actually remembered. He looked at the mustard jar, then back at Latoya. "Then stay," he commanded, though it sounded like a plea. "Stay with her. I'll provide the palace, but you provide the home." The transition from the back alley diner to the marble-floored expanse of Aries was a jump between centuries. But Latoya Brown walked through the gleaming industrial kitchen as if she had designed every inch of it. The air here didn't smell of old grease. It smelled of rosemary, sea salt, and the sharp metallic tang of expensive knives. The staff, a collection of culinary elites in starch-white coats, stood in a rigid line, their eyes darting between the black woman in the simple server's uniform and the silent, dark-suited man standing in the shadows of the doorway. Jae-hyun had given her the title of manager, but Latoya knew he had actually given her a battlefield. She walked to the center of the line, her footsteps silent on the non-slip tiles. She didn't look at their resumes or their polished clogs. She looked at their hands. "The man who owned the last kitchen I worked in is currently hiding in his office because a video made him nervous," Latoya said, her voice cutting through the hum of the walk-in refrigerators with the same flat certainty she'd used on the gunman. "I don't care where you trained. I don't care about your Michelin stars. In this kitchen, we have one rule. The woman in the red coat eats first. She eats exactly what she asks for, and she is never, under any circumstances, made to feel like she is in the way." A young sous chef, his ego visible in the tightness of his jaw, stepped forward. "And who are you to tell us—" Latoya didn't raise her voice. She simply stepped into his space, her presence expanding until the high ceilings felt low. "I am the person who knows that if Myung-suk gets confused, the sound of a dropped tray will feel like a bomb to her. I am the person who knows that if you burn her toast, she won't complain. She'll just stop eating for 2 days because she thinks she's a burden. If you can't handle that level of precision, leave now." The kitchen went silent. It was a hierarchy being dismantled and rebuilt in real time. From the shadows, Jae-hyun watched her. He saw his chefs, men who usually took orders from no one, lower their heads in a silent acknowledgement of her authority. She was running his flagship like a fortress, not for profit, but for the sanity of a woman who didn't even know her own name. Latoya turned her back on a staff and moved to the small private prep station she had had installed near the exit. Myung-suk was sitting there, fascinated by a bowl of snap peas. Latoya picked up a knife, her movements fluid and rhythmic. She didn't look at Jae-hyun, but she knew he was there. She was showing him that in this world of fire and steel, his power meant nothing without her heart. Under her watch, the kitchen didn't just produce food, it produced safety. And for the first time in 15 years, as the rhythmic thwack-thwack of Latoya's knife filled the room, the tension in Jae-hyun's shoulders began to dissolve. He had hired a manager, but he had found a general. The lights of Aries had been dimmed to a soft, amber glow, casting long shadows across the empty dining room. The scent of expensive cologne and seared scallops had faded, replaced by the clean, sharp smell of lemon oil and the lingering dampness of the city night outside. Myung-suk was asleep in the private suite upstairs, her breathing finally rhythmic and deep, leaving the vast restaurant to the 2 people who stood guard over her soul. Jae-hyun sat at the far end of the bar, his tie loosened for the first time since Latoya had met him. He wasn't the king of the soul underworld in this light. He was just a man looking at his empty hands. Latoya approached him, not with a cocktail or a menu, but with 2 simple ceramic mugs. A thin trail of steam rose from them, smelling of roasted barley and earth. She set a mug in front of him and took the stool 2 seats away, leaving a deliberate canyon of space between them. "Barley tea," she said, her voice low, weaving through the silence. "She used to make it for me in the diner on the nights when the pipes froze. She said it was the smell of home." Jae-hyun picked up the cup, cradling it in his palms as if he were trying to draw the heat into his very bones. He took a slow sip, his eyes closing. "She used to toast the grains herself," he murmured. "The whole house would smell like a harvest even in the middle of the city. I spent 15 years trying to buy back that smell. I bought estates, tea houses, entire blocks of land. None of it ever tasted like this." He turned his head to look at her. The sharp, predatory edge of his gaze had softened into something resembling exhaustion. "Why did you do it, Latoya? You didn't know who she was. You didn't know there was a reward for her face. You were a waitress making $8 an hour and you took a bullet's path for her." Latoya looked out at the dark street through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Because everyone else looked through her," she said simply. "To them, she was just a slow cook who forgot the orders. To me, she was the only person who didn't ask me what I'd survived before she offered me a chair. You don't put a price on that, Jae-hyun. You just protect it." Jae-hyun lowered his head, his reflection dancing in the dark amber liquid. For a moment, the silence wasn't a tactical standoff, it was a bridge. He realized that while he had been searching for a mother, Latoya had been being a daughter. The debt he owed her wasn't something that could be cleared with a bank transfer or a job title, it was a debt of life. "I used to think power was the only way to keep things safe," Jae-hyun said, his voice barely a whisper. "Power just makes people want to take from you," Latoya replied, standing up to take her mug to the back. "Kindness is what makes them stay." She left him there in the amber light, a man with everything finally realizing that the most valuable thing he owned was currently washing a teacup in the back. The calm of the early morning shift was broken not by a gun, but by a smell. The sharp copper tang of fresh blood cutting through the aroma of brewing coffee. Latoya was setting the stations when Jae-hyun walked through the staff entrance. He moved with his usual predatory grace, but his rhythm was off, a slight hitch in his stride that he was trying to bury under the weight of his charcoal overcoat. He didn't head for the office. He went straight to the bar, sinking into a stool with a heaviness that made the wood groan. Latoya didn't say a word. She poured a cup of black coffee and set it in front of him, her eyes tracking the way he kept his right hand tucked into his pocket. "The delivery for the Wagyu is late," she said, her voice a low, steady anchor, "and the sous chef thinks he's ready for the menu change. He's wrong." Jae-hyun didn't respond. He reached for the coffee with his left hand, but the steam seemed to irritate whatever he was hiding. Finally, with a weary sigh, he pulled his right hand from his pocket and rested it on the marble counter. The knuckles were split, the skin a violent shade of purple and obsidian. A deep gash ran across the back of his hand, still seeping, the edges jagged and angry. It wasn't the wound of a man who had been attacked. It was the wound of a man who had spent the night breaking things, or people. Latoya didn't flinch. She didn't gasp or offer the hollow comfort of a stranger. She simply walked to the first aid kit hidden beneath the bar, pulled out a bottle of antiseptic and a roll of gauze, and stood before him. "I thought you said this place was for guarding what matters," she said, her gaze lifting to meet his. Her eyes were hard, searching for the man who had shared barley tea with her just nights before. This hand looks like it was busy destroying. Jae-hyun's jaw tightened. "There are people who think they can take advantage of my mother's location now that she is out of the shadows. I had to remind them why that is a fatal mistake." Latoya grabbed his wrist. Her touch was firm, professional, and entirely unimpressed by his darkness. As she pressed the antiseptic-soaked cotton to the wound, Jae-hyun winced, his fingers curling instinctively. "You can't keep her safe by becoming the monster she doesn't remember," Latoya whispered, her voice like a velvet blade. She began to wrap the gauze, her movements precise. "If you bring that world into this kitchen, you aren't protecting her. You're just building her a prettier cage." Jae-hyun looked at his hand, now white and bandaged by the woman who had saved his mother. The violence of his night felt suddenly small, almost pathetic against the quiet, fierce dignity of her care. He realized then that Latoya wasn't afraid of the mafia boss. She was disappointed in the man. And for Jae-hyun, that was far more painful than any wound. The piece Latoya had built within the walls of Aries was a fragile glass structure, and it shattered with the simple sound of a heavy footfall in the foyer. It was the mid-afternoon lull, that hollow hour when the light turned gold and the kitchen hummed with the quiet prep of evening service. Latoya was adjusting the collar of Myung-suk's red coat, preparing for their daily walk in the courtyard, when she looked up and felt the air vanish from the room. Standing by the host stand was a man who looked like a ghost carved from granite. Marcus. He didn't belong in a place of marble and silk. He belonged to the damp basements and the bruising shadows of the life Latoya had fled 3 years ago. He was the debt she thought she'd paid in blood and silence, the man who had taught her that love was just another word for ownership. "Toya," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that made the scars on her back ache through her uniform. "You've done well for yourself, a long way from the gutter." Latoya didn't move. Her system didn't scream. It went into the deep, terrifying freeze of a hunted animal that has nowhere left to run. Her hand, still resting on Myung-suk's shoulder, began to tremble, a betrayal of the iron composure she had maintained even when a gun was pointed at her head. This was different. This wasn't a random robber. This was the architect of her nightmares. "You shouldn't be here, Marcus," she whispered. Her voice, usually a steady anchor, sounded thin, like dry leaves skittering over pavement. "I go where my property goes," he replied, his eyes scanning the room with a predatory greed, lingering on the expensive artwork and finally settling on Myung-suk. He smiled, a slow, jagged expression that never reached his eyes. "And it looks like you found something valuable to protect. That makes you expensive, Toya. Very expensive." Myung-suk, sensing the sudden jagged shift in the atmosphere, gripped Latoya's hand. "Toya, who is the man? He has a loud face. I don't like his face." Latoya stepped in front of her, the instinct to shield overriding her terror, but for the first time her armor felt paper-thin. She wasn't the woman who looked at rain like she was already soaked. She was the girl who remembered what it was like to drown. From the upper mezzanine, the click of polished shoes on stone announced Jae-hyun's arrival. He looked down at the scene, his eyes locking onto Marcus with the cold, lethal precision of a predator identifying a scavenger. But Latoya didn't look up at him. She was staring at Marcus, realizing that the wolf hadn't just found the door, he was already inside. The stakes had shifted. It wasn't just about a job or a memory anymore. It was about whether the past would finally be allowed to finish what it started. The silence following Marcus's departure was more deafening than the confrontation itself. Jae-hyun moved through the restaurant like a controlled landslide, his men already dispersing to the perimeter with a lethal, quiet efficiency. He reached the center of the room, his eyes dark with a protective fury that Latoya recognized. It was the same look he had when he spoke of his mother's disappearance. "He won't breathe the same air as you by tonight," Jae-hyun said, his voice a low, vibrating growl. He reached out as if to take her arm, to usher her into the safety of the back offices. "I'll handle the debt. I'll erase him. You and my mother will be moved to the estate in the hills. I have the resources to fix this, Latoya. I can make it like he never existed." Latoya stepped back, her heels clicking sharply against the marble. The freeze that had gripped her in Marcus's presence shattered, replaced by a heat that burned hotter than any kitchen fire. She didn't look like a woman who needed a savior. She looked like a woman who was tired of being treated like a prize to be won or a problem to be solved. "Fix this?" she repeated, her voice cutting through his dark promises like a blade. "Is that what you think I am? A broken machine you can just throw money and muscle at until the noise stops?" She stepped toward him, forcing the mafia boss to actually look at her, not as the guardian of his mother, but as a person. "I didn't survive Marcus for 3 years and a robbery last week just to become your project, Jae-hyun. You think you're different from him because you wear a better suit and offer a golden cage instead of a lead one, but you're both doing the same thing. You're trying to decide my worth for me." Jae-hyun opened his mouth to protest, but she held up a hand, her eyes flashing. "I accepted this job because I love Myung-suk, not because I needed a king to hide behind. If Marcus is the wolf at the door, that's my door to lock. If I let you erase him, I'm just trading one master for another. I don't want your hills and I don't want your protection if it comes with a leash. I have spent my whole life being made small by men who thought they were doing me a favor. I'm done." She straightened her collar, her breathing even, her stance as immovable as the day she faced the gunman. "I am not a debt to be paid. I am not a project to be fixed. I am the woman who stood in front of your mother when no one else would. If you want to help me, you stand beside me, but don't you dare try to handle me." She turned and walked toward the kitchen, leaving the most powerful man in the city standing alone in the center of his own palace, finally realizing that some things could never be owned. 6 months later, the rain was the same, but the world around it had transformed. The silver and chrome diner where it all began had been demolished, replaced by a small community garden that Latoya managed in her spare hours. But the real heart of their new life beat within the penthouse above Aries. It was a space designed not for a mafia boss, but for a woman who needed to see the horizon and an elderly lady who needed to feel the sun. Latoya stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city lights flicker like fallen stars. She no longer wore the white pillbox hat or the starch-stiff server's uniform. She wore a silk wrap dress, the color of midnight. Her posture relaxed, her hands no longer flattened against a counter in a defensive strike. She was the director of operations for Jae-hyun's legal holdings, a title she had earned by dismantling his inefficient hierarchies with the same cold precision she'd used to dismantle a robber's ego. Behind her, the sound of a soft, melodic hum filled the room. Myung-suk sat at a mahogany table, her red coat draped over a nearby chair. She refused to let it go, a tactile reminder of the day she was found. She was folding napkins into intricate birds, a skill she'd regained as her mind found a new, quiet kind of stability. Jae-hyun entered from the balcony, the scent of the night air clinging to his coat. He didn't look like a man who broke things anymore. The bandage was long gone from his hand, leaving only a faint, jagged scar across his knuckles, a mark he kept as a reminder of the night he almost chose the wrong path. He walked to the table and sat beside his mother. He didn't ask her if she remembered him today. He simply picked up a napkin and began to help her fold. "The gala raised $2 million for the youth center," Jae-hyun said, his eyes meeting Latoya's across the room. There was no command in his voice, only the steady, grounded respect of a partner. "Marcus's old territory has been cleared. The kids there, they won't have to grow up looking for wolves." Latoya walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. She felt him lean into her touch, not as a master, but as a man who had finally found home. "They have a shield now," Latoya whispered. Myung-suk looked up, her eyes clearing for a fleeting, beautiful second. She looked at Jae-hyun, then at Latoya, and a small, knowing smile touched her lips. She didn't call him her son, and she didn't call Latoya her waitress. She simply reached out and placed her hands over theirs, pulling their palms together until they touched. "It's a good morning," Myung-suk said, her voice clear and bright. The rain stopped. Outside, the clouds parted, revealing a sliver of moon. The debt was paid, the ghosts were gone, and for the first time in 15 years, the silence in the room wasn't heavy. It was whole. 6 months later, the rain was the same, but the world around it had transformed. The silver and chrome diner where it all began had been demolished, replaced by a small community garden that Latoya managed in her spare hours. But the real heart of their new life beat within the penthouse above Aries. It was a space designed not for a mafia boss, but for a woman who needed to see the horizon and an elderly lady who needed to feel the sun. Latoya stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city lights flicker like fallen stars. She no longer wore the white pillbox hat or the starch-stiff server's uniform. She wore a silk wrap dress the color of midnight, her posture relaxed, her hands no longer flattened against a counter in a defensive strike. She was the director of operations for Jae-hyun's legal holdings, a title she had earned by dismantling his inefficient hierarchies with the same cold precision she'd used to dismantle a robber's ego. Behind her, the sound of a soft, melodic hum filled the room. Myung-suk sat at a mahogany table, her red coat draped over a nearby chair. She refused to let it go, a tactile reminder of the day she was found. She was folding napkins into intricate birds, a skill she'd regained as her mind found a new, quiet kind of stability. Jae-hyun entered from the balcony, the scent of the night air clinging to his coat. He didn't look like a man who broke things anymore. The bandage was long gone from his hand, leaving only a faint, jagged scar across his knuckles, a mark he kept as a reminder of the night he almost chose the wrong path. He walked to the table and sat beside his mother. He didn't ask her if she remembered him today. He simply picked up a napkin and began to help her fold. "The gala raised $2 million for the youth center," Jae-hyun said, his eyes meeting Latoya's across the room. There was no command in his voice, only the steady, grounded respect of a partner. Marcus's old territory has been cleared. The kids there, they won't have to grow up looking for wolves. Latoya walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. She felt him lean into her touch, not as a master, but as a man who had finally found home. "They have a shield now," Latoya whispered. Myung-suk looked up, her eyes clearing for a fleeting, beautiful second. She looked at Jae-hyun, then at Latoya, and a small, knowing smile touched her lips. She didn't call him her son, and she didn't call Latoya her waitress. She simply reached out and placed her hands over theirs, pulling their palms together until they touched. "It's a good morning," Myung-suk said, her voice clear and bright. The rain stopped. Outside, the clouds parted, revealing a sliver of moon. The debt was paid, the ghosts were gone, and for the first time in 15 years, the silence in the room wasn't heavy, it was whole.